Here we go, right?
Yeah, just right on cue.
All right, I have to get there so I can. Okay, I'm not sure if we're on or not. Says we should be. Maybe Christina can let me know if I did that correctly. Okay, we're on. So good morning, I'm Lori Shaw. I'm on the Education Committee for Meigs Point Nature Center, and I schedule all our speaker events, sometimes in person and right now, of course, online. Russ is not able to be here today. He had an obligation, so he asked me to introduce our first speaker in the series of wildlife in Connecticut. We're going to focus on mammals for the months of February and March. You can go to our calendar at meigspointnaturecenter.org/calendar to see all of our wonderful speakers. You can register on Zoom, or you can always watch on Facebook Live. Our programs are also archived on our website if you're not able to watch them live, and that's meigspointnaturecenter.org. Our programs are sponsored by Friends of Hammonasset. We hope you'll become a member. They do lots of wonderful things in the park, including sponsor things for Meigs Point Nature Center. So today we have a guest speaker. Before I introduce him, I want to let you know that we're going to hold all our questions until the end. You can type them in the chat bar or in the comments, and I will share them with Scott at the end. So we have Dr. Scott Williams. He's a research scientist in the Department of Forestry and Horticulture at the Connecticut Ag Station, and he's been there doing research for the last 20 years on white-tailed deer and invasive species and their impact on the tick population. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and thanks for being here.
Very good, thank you. Hello, and as Lori said, I'm going to be giving a talk on white-tailed deer, and white-tailed deer are great, beautiful animals, but too many of them can have pretty damaging consequences on the ecosystem and public health alike. So that's what my talk's going to focus a bit on, is how they're ecosystem engineers and their role in ticks and tick-borne diseases, and give you a little bit of tick ecology, maybe some stuff you weren't necessarily familiar with. So I hope you get something from the talk. And let's see, I'm going to share my host disabled participant screen sharing. Oh, this is going to be a problem.
All right, hang on.
So it's saying I'm unable to.
I'm going to get you on.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Let's see. All right, here we go. So the title of my talk is Deer and Tick-Borne Diseases, Concerns for the Forest and Public Health Alike. This is sort of a conglomerate of all of our research we've done over the years on ticks, on invasive plants, on Lyme disease, and deer as well. And it just comes up to a common theme that ecosystems in poor health, like you see in the bottom left there, that's the Japanese barberry stand, tend to be better tick habitat. So ecosystem in poor health is going to be detrimental to human health through increased tick-borne disease risk. So common theme here is that if we do proper management and keep our forests healthy, it benefits the forest ecosystem, the wildlife in it, and public health alike. So first, I'm sure you guys, most of you are probably here in Connecticut, and I'm sure you're well aware of the tick-borne disease issue here. But maybe this is some of the stuff you didn't know. A lot of the stats here are from 2017. 2017 was the record year of tick-borne disease cases in history in the United States. So it's a pretty significant year. And as you can see, things keep rising and rising. But anyhow, this is the majority of reported vector-borne diseases are in fact spread by ticks. About 95% of the reported cases, in fact, of which about 68% are Lyme disease cases. So obviously that's the most common, and we tend to focus on that because people are aware of it. But there's also some other pathogens that the ticks could pass to people that I will tell you about. But mosquito or flea-borne diseases, as you can see, only account for about 5% of reported cases. And we do see a lot of mosquito new reports in the news, and it gets a lot of press for some reason. I think it's because some of those mosquito-borne diseases have higher fatality rates than some of the tick-borne diseases, even though the tick-borne diseases count for a heck of a lot more cases overall. These are some of the nasty pathogens that the ticks in the United States carry. The ones in blue are the ones that we have here locally. And let's see, this is the diseases that the pathogens the diseases that are caused by the pathogens. The ticks don't carry the disease, their ticks carry the pathogens that then get injected into you that gives you the disease. So ticks don't carry Lyme disease, they carry Borrelia here, that is the causal agent of Lyme disease. So that's your one lesson for today. Anyhow, some of the diseases these pathogens cause are anaplasmosis, babesiosis, Lyme disease, Borrelia miyamotoi infection, which is a fairly new species of Borrelia, and Borrelia mayani, that's another one. But also Bourbon virus, could be Colorado tick fever, ehrlichiosis, Heartland virus, red meat allergy. I'll talk a little bit about that. That's up and coming here and kind of scary for some folks. And a whole host of others. Oh, Powassan virus is one you might have heard in the news too. Our ticks carry that. It's fairly rare, but it's of concern as well. On the left here, you can see in 1996, and each dot was placed in a county in the state that reported a Lyme disease case. And you can see it's pretty much restricted to Connecticut and the upper mid-Atlantic, New Jersey here. And then fast forward to 2017, we're seeing, you know, the entire Northeast and Pennsylvania and so forth with Lyme disease cases here, and this pocket over here in the upper Midwest. A lot of these spotty ones throughout the rest of the country are travel related. For the most part, people travel to the Northeast or upper Midwest and bring a case home and are reported at home. But it's the problem's accelerating. It's becoming, as the ticks radiate out, they're becoming more and more common as their pathogens are passing around. So this is a similar theme. This down here we have reported and confirmed and probable cases. Here back in the late 90s, it was around 15,000. This is nationwide. And then as you can see, I mentioned 2017 as this bar here was the highest reported cases. Only about 10% of the cases are actually reported. It's becoming pretty commonplace, so a lot of doctors don't even report them. So as a result, you know, we multiply by 10 the numbers, and then you have, you know, what's actually happening out there. So it's closer to 300,000 to 430,000 cases of Lyme disease annually, when only around 30 to 40,000 cases are reported. And this is showing a similar increasing trend here. This is for the other lesser known diseases such as anaplasmosis, ehrlichiosis, and spotted fever group rickettsiosis. So as I mentioned, it's not as prevalent, but you're seeing the same exponential growth in cases over the years. So ticks are expanding, the pathogens are expanding, and it's just something people should be wary about. Here in Connecticut, we keep getting more and more ticks. We're discovering more and more. Right now, we have about 17 species of them. And in comparison, there's around 11 or 12 in New Jersey and 30 or so in New York State. And as I mentioned, these numbers keep changing as we discover new tick species in state, which seems to be happening with more frequency these days. 3 species here in Connecticut commonly bite humans. This is the black-legged tick on the left, otherwise known as our deer tick, generic, but it's black-legged tick is the better name for it, because deer ticks are different species of ticks throughout the nation depending on where you live. This is American dog tick here. This is one people are probably most aware of. When we were younger, when your kids were younger, this was the tick that was more of a nuisance, and we didn't worry about too much because it doesn't really pass too many pathogens, whereas nowadays it's the black-legged or deer tick. And one that's knocking on the door here in Connecticut is the Lone Star tick, easily identifiable by this white dot on the back of the female. These are aggressive, very fast-moving ticks, and these are the guys that are responsible for the red meat allergy, as well as ehrlichiosis in state. We recently found a few reproducing populations of them on the coast in Fairfield County, and we continue to pick up individuals here and there throughout the state. Species in number. So at the ag station, we provide a tick testing service to the public. People can submit ticks that they find feeding on them or their family members to us for testing, free of charge, for pathogen testing. And so let's see, this was back in 2017. So the vast majority, you can see about 80% of the ticks submitted are in fact black-legged or deer ticks, whereas 18% are dog ticks. Over here, Lone Star ticks were only about 2% back in 2017, but this is an increasing percentage over the past decade or so. And then we have other random species that account for, a very small percentage of them that people may encounter when they're traveling or something. The deer tick, black-legged tick, is a three-host tick. Actually, most of the ones I just described are three-host ticks, meaning they're hatched as larvae. They find usually a ground-dwelling animal like a mouse or a chipmunk or a bird here, and they latch on and they feed upon them, and then they fall off after that blood meal. They molt, they become nymphs, which are low to the ground, and they'll feed on pretty much anything. No size requirement, deer, whatever they can latch onto, birds, and so on. Then those guys overwinter, and they emerge in the spring as adults. And the adults feed on, they emerge as nymphs and then find a blood meal in the spring, and then they'll emerge in the fall as adults. But the adult female requires a large animal like a deer to feed upon. 90% of female black-legged ticks in our area feed on white-tailed deer. So deer are a very important host in the life cycle of the black-legged tick. And where you encounter ticks, there's typically at home. That's where you spend the majority of your time. About 75% of the ticks in this study were acquired at home. 21% were away from home, and 5% in the neighborhood. So obviously where you spend more time is where you're going to encounter them more frequently. And you can see obviously the activities, just outdoor play, walking the dog, yard work, camping, hiking, all these are where you can encounter a tick. So this is, deer are very charismatic, but they're also complicit in deer ticks and tick-borne diseases, as I mentioned. I'll get into this a bit here. So I mentioned the tick cycle. I just mentioned that. There's another graphic of it and the seasonality of it. New England here, deer are the principal host. As I mentioned, at any one time, there could be thousands of black-legged ticks on a white-tailed deer. I already mentioned all this. But I mentioned that the adults have a size requirement for need a large host like a deer. They're pretty conspicuous, and deer is a large body, so then they don't groom as frequently, and as well as some of the medium-sized mammals like raccoons and opossums. But the lower stages, lesser stages, don't really care what they feed on. They just need literally a warm body. So a deer or whatever goes by, they're going to feed on it, though they're often associated with some of the smaller mammals. And deer population throughout New England, specifically Connecticut and the Mid-Atlantic, has grown pretty exponentially over the past 100, 120 years or so. This is pretty dramatic growth, similar exponential growth that we were seeing with the ticks and tick-borne pathogens. And it's, this exponential growth here in the deer herd is why we're seeing that growth ticks and diseases and so forth. So this is pretty dramatic. We've kind of leveled off here a little bit throughout, the early 20th, first century here, but there's still plenty of deer around. This is a paper done, data done by data from a paper done here locally in Connecticut, where deer density here was reduced significantly, represented by this dotted line, by a controlled hunt in Groton, Connecticut. And the deer population was dropped all the way down here to virtually zero on this peninsular community. And because the ticks have that 2-year life cycle, on a 2-year lag here, we see the nymphal stages of the tick. That's the second juvenile stage. We see that plummet here, with the lag time after the deer herd collapsed, because with fewer hosts like that, ticks aren't going to be getting blood meals, aren't going to progress to the next life stage, and are ultimately going to die without feeding. And then as we see the deer population rebound here, we see a subsequent rebound here in the tick population a couple years later, and then we see a few more deer probably immigrated on site here, and we see this dramatic increase here as well. So there's deer and the tick populations are positively correlated. You have more deer, you have more ticks. But deer are dilution hosts as far as the pathogen goes, in that they're not reservoir competent for a lot of the pathogens. Like, for instance, deer don't carry Borrelia, and they're unable to pass that pathogen back to the ticks. So where you have more deer, you have more ticks, but you have a lesser percentage of the ticks infected with the various pathogens. This gross picture down here is from that population of established Lone Star ticks down in Norwalk, Connecticut. This is a deer our DEP wildlife colleagues captured, and these are just a whole mass of Lone Star ticks engorged, feeding on it. Their ears were hanging down. They were so heavy with the weight of this. So we're in the process of managing that population, and just published a paper on successful management of that population on white-tailed deer. So with significant deer management, you have fewer reservoir incompetent hosts, meaning fewer hosts that could pass the pathogen back to the tick. So the ticks are out there looking for whatever they can feed upon, and they typically wind up encountering mice or chipmunks or some of those smaller rodents that are able to pass those pathogens on. So while you see a reduction overall in the number of ticks on the landscape, you see a temporary perceived amplification in the abundance of, I'm sorry, I got turned around there. So the ticks are desperately seeking for a host. And if you do some sampling, it seems as if there's a lot more ticks on the landscape because they are not on a host and desperately seeking a host. So it appears that a year or so after, there's an increase in abundance overall. But also they're forced to switch to feeding on remaining competent hosts. So you see that increase in infection in the ticks, even though you're seeing lesser abundance over time. So this is a paper we did in Redding, Connecticut a few years ago. One of the treatments was deer removal. As you can see here, we took out quite a few deer, reduced the population fairly significantly, not to levels that we had wanted to. So we removed hosts, but not all of them. So there were some existing on the landscape. And this is, we also trapped mice. So where we reduced deer, the year after, we saw a significant increase in the number of mice that were infected with the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. And that, again, is because with fewer deer on the landscape to act as that dilution host, you see ticks prioritizing feeding on mice in those competent reservoirs and getting infected. That carries through to the third year of the study over here, and then when we do the average here as well. So where you remove deer marginally, you actually increase the percent of mice in the landscape that were infected. So very interesting ecological find, consistent with the literature, but interesting just the same. So the lesson here is, if you're going to do deer removal, you have to do very significant deer removal down to less than 10 individuals per square mile, which is pretty difficult to achieve without professional help. So that's a bit of a lesson on deer and ticks and so forth. And then we did some invasive plant work, and we were showing how deer are kind of engineering that and engineering poor habitat quality overall, or good habitat quality for some of these ticks. When I first started doing research at the station back in the early 2000s, we did the infamous poop study. Back then, there were many, many more deer in the landscape than there are now. And we basically went around and collected deer poop for 4 years. And I gathered on the order of, let's see, I forget, like 500 or so pellets, deep pellet piles over 4 years. We basically just planted them in the greenhouse and documented what grew out of them. Pretty cool study, pretty easy to do, low cost, and we got great results, and that makes for a great talk. Here is where we did our study. This is the town of North Branford. This is Lake Gillard right here. This is owned by the South Central Connecticut Regional Water Authority. We have a great relationship with them, and they permit us to do research on their property. So at the time, there's about 60 deer per square mile on that 7,000 acre property. And from 2002 to 2005, I gathered upwards of 600 deer poops. And then we put them in the freezer for 2 months, and that makes the seeds within think they live through the winter. So they come through with increased vigor, and they're more likely to germinate when they're planted in pro mix in a growing medium in the greenhouse. And then we put 4 poop samples per tray. And then we had 1 control tray for 8 treatment trays, where we just had soil in there to make sure that the seed wasn't contained within the soil or contaminating within the greenhouse. And it looks just like this, just a bunch of deer poop in the soil. And then we lightly covered this with the pro mix that you see that they're sitting upon, and just kept it watered over time in the greenhouse. We started to see stuff like this germinating. These poops are their own little fertilizer packets as well. And then this is a little pokeweed forest that obviously the seed within here was unable to escape encapsulation. It probably will over time. And then little fungi growing, probably not as a result of ingestion, probably contamination. But some of the stuff we grew was American pokeweed, which is a native plant, a native weed, you could call it, to Connecticut. That produces these fruits that are poisonous. The plant itself is poisonous to some, but the birds and deer apparently readily consumed the fruits of this and the seeds within. Another one was Canadian clearweed. This is another native plant, about 600 germinants here. And the vast majority of our seedlings grew, so about 7,000 of them were this exotic purslane, which any gardener is familiar with. This is edible and quite delectable, actually, and fairly healthy. It's a succulent, and these little seed pods here, I believe, are ballistically spread, but also obviously consumed by animals when going to eat the foliage. That's very succulent. But surprisingly, the majority, and that's exotic, sorry, that's not native to the state of Connecticut. And as same with Carolina horse nettle, if you have a hay field, you're familiar with this. It's a thorny weed. It's in the Nightshade family. It's related to tomatoes, and these little guys are tomato-like fruits. Each contain about 200 to 300 seeds, and the deer were consuming them just as if they were, wild tomatoes, and seeds are passing through them. Wineberry is another one you're probably familiar with. This is also exotic to the state of Connecticut. We grew about 500 seedlings here. This is quite delectable. It's very sweet. It's a type of raspberry, and you've probably consumed numerous of these over the years and not really realized what it was. But this is invasive wineberry, not to be confused with our red raspberries and black raspberries, and blackberries, and so forth. This is lamb's quarter. This is actually another quite healthy weed. So what happened here is that strategy here is that the plant here puts this foliage here that's very edible. You can see it looks like this has been chopped down right here, adjacent to the seeds. So when the herbivores go to eat this foliage here, they inadvertently consume some of the seeds here. And no, this is of note, Chenopodium is the same genus that quinoa is in. So this is a relative of quinoa, which is obviously is quite healthy. Another one was a vetch, which is typically grown as a ground cover. Another one was black nightshade, again related to tomatoes, and this is poison to some, but the deer were consuming fruits of it. Multiflora rose. These rose hips are delicious and healthy and full of vitamin C, but also another exotic plant, as with common plantain here, which is a very common lawn weed, red root amaranth. And we grew 2 apple trees, and we grew a stalk of corn, which is kind of funny. It grew to about 4 feet out of the trays, and then we grew a green pepper plant as well that actually produced fruit, so that was kind of fun. But ultimately, we discovered that deer transport alien invasive species, as that buck just did across the screen. We grew nearly 12,000 seedlings of 87 unique taxa, and 51 of those taxa were not native to the state of Connecticut, which 80% of the seedlings were exotic species to the state of Connecticut. So we determined that one deer can disperse 500 seeds per day, of which 80% of those seeds are exotic. So for 400, so deer at that time were transporting 400 seeds per day by consuming them, and typically in the residential settings, and moving on to the water company property during the day and defecating and putting those seeds into the seed bank to germinate at a later date. So in this case, deer are shaping the ecosystem to favor invasive exotic understory. It seems they prefer feeding on invasives, but they'll also feed on natives, which gives the invasives a competitive advantage. And the thing with exotics, I guess I don't think they necessarily were consuming them with greater frequency than natives. But the thing with exotics is invasives they are exotic and invasive because they're just very prolific seed producers. And deer either were actively consuming fruits, maybe because there wasn't a lot of other browse available, or they were inadvertently browsing the seeds when they're going for the foliage. But in consuming all the native stuff, they release the exotics and give that a competitive advantage, in addition to transporting their seeds around the landscape. And then we, after that study, we were looking at Japanese barberry, which is an invasive on the landscape. And ironically, we didn't grow any barberry out of the deer poop because there aren't very many plants that are deer resistant, but Japanese barberry is one that the deer will not consume, though I have seen them eating the fruits of barberry in the late fall and winter when there's nothing else really for them to consume on the landscape. But it would appear the seed of barberry is so wimpy that it just gets either crushed or digested and isn't viable when it comes out the other end. Anyhow, Japanese barberry, if you're not familiar, is a plant that's exotic to Connecticut. It creates very dense stands. And my boss, Dr. Jeff Ward, is a forester, and he was looking at ways to control it to increase native plant regeneration. And in doing so, and in controlling it, we were noticing we were getting a lot of ticks on us while wading through this horrible thorny plant. And I went with the tick aspect of it, and we've published 10 or 12 papers on it now, about half on the relationship with ticks and half with various control strategies. So I took the tick component, he took the control, and this is a little summing up about his work. We had 6 sites throughout 2007, upwards to 2010, where we controlled barberry of various acreages, some of which was on regional water authorities, some on private lands. But our first step in winter was to take this tracked bobcat, and this is called a fecon mower. This is a rotating hydraulically driven drum, and these are carbide teeth on it that just chews down pretty much anything in its path. trees, shrubs, whatever. But this is the remnants of its work on a very large Japanese barberry plant, and it renders it down to these little nubby root stems here. Anyhow, so that was the first thing, and we did it in the winter because we didn't want to disrupt the soil, and was to knock it back. And we had 3 treatments. We had an intact barberry stand, which is just an area we marked off and didn't do anything to whatsoever. And then a managed barberry stand, which I'm describing now, where we took what was previously an intact stand and managed it and killed it. And then we had a third stand where barberry didn't exist, or it was very low in abundance. And so after we did the initial treatment, we let the roots, in that late winter, we let the root stock, the root reserves from the plant put up, the death throes of whatever they had remaining, and put up some more barberry shoots in hopes of surviving. And then after a month or 2, we came back and hit that stressed out plant with some herbicides. And then we had a control plot where we did nothing to and just cut it down that one time. And then all non-chemical treatment, we used this propane torch to kill it. As you can see on the right here, it basically just heat girdles, it boils the sap and girdles the stem and kills it that way, which is fun for about 20 minutes, but it gets old after a while when you're doing acres and acres of this. But anyhow, after we did that, we came through, and from 2007 all the way to 2016, we estimated the barberry cover on these various plots in these various locations. And we were able to determine changes over time and determine which treatment was most successful. And then we flagged or sampled for adult black-legged ticks in these 3 treatments in the fall from 2007 to 2016 as well. And we trapped mice, which, as you know, are hosts for the juvenile stages and the various pathogens during that time frame as well. And we were able to look at tick abundances, rodent abundances, and then we were able to look at infected tick abundances between the treatments and infected rodents between the treatments. While this is a fairly busy graph over the years we did the study, these gray bars here, these ones right here, are all the intact barberry. So it didn't really change much over the years. And then we have the grayer bars down here, which represent where we manage barberry. And you can see it starts off pretty low here initially in terms of barberry cover. And then you can see it start growing a little bit over the years. And, while we did have fairly good control, you see it growing back. And where the black bar is where barberry didn't exist, and that stays pretty consistent. But obviously where we manage barberry, the rootstock is still there, and we were able to control it for about 5 years, and after about 5 years it came back, not to levels that had been previously, but it did start coming back. So as a result, we recommend treatment every 5 years or so. And I apologize, this is an even busier graph, but this is Borrelia infected black-legged ticks that we had in between our various treatments. And what's important here is later on, every year, the intact barberry stands were significantly higher than no barberry in terms of these infected ticks. In the years 2 through 6, we were able to take a managed barberry stand and turn it into essentially a no barberry stand. So the infection rates were no different for years 2 to 6. But as I mentioned, as the barberry came back, so too did the infection in the ticks. So conclusions we came from this: one, deer are, because they're consuming everything else on the landscape and not barberry, they're contributing to its success. But we were able to show that barberry can be effectively controlled if you're more stubborn than the plant itself. Excuse me. We also found there were nearly 4 times as many adult black-legged ticks in the barberry stands, and we determined there was nearly 5 times as many Borrelia infected adult black-legged ticks in barberry stands. So you have more ticks and higher infection in barberry than no barberry or a managed stands. And it's because the barberry creates a human microclimate where the ticks can hang out pretty much all day just seeking a host. And even in the dead of summer, or more like in the fall, it's the humidity stays around in these stands, and the ticks don't have to retreat to the leaf litter so they don't dry out. They can just hang out and wait for a host all day long. And if you're doing that, you're going to be more successful in obtaining a host, finding a host, and obtaining a blood meal, and progressing, be able to lay eggs and complete the life cycle. So deer inadvertently are contributing to this by their presence, but also by engineering the landscape to encourage Japanese barberry. So that's a bit, some of the stuff we've been working on. And the overall conclusions to what we've been finding is that deer are beautiful animals. They're absolutely gorgeous. They're charismatic. They're very elegant. If you ever watch them move through the landscape, they're wonderful animals, but too many of them can have disastrous impacts, both on public health, in terms of vehicle collisions, which a lot of people don't think of when they think of it. But if you're a motorcyclist and you encounter a deer, things don't usually fare too well for you if you're on a motorcycle. Same with a vehicle. A lot of injuries and unfortunately fatalities with deer don't occur from hitting the deer directly, but people trying to avoid the deer and hitting another vehicle, a pedestrian or a phone pole or something, and unfortunately that doesn't turn out too well either. Tick-borne illnesses, as I hope you gathered from this talk, that when you have increased deer, you have increased ticks, and your people are more likely to encounter a tick and get a tick-borne illness where you have overabundant populations of white-tailed deer. And in terms of ecosystem health, as I mentioned, also they stifle native regeneration. They preferentially browse, meaning they eat the stuff they like first, and then they go down the line in terms of palatability. So the stuff they like isn't really found on the landscape anymore. The stuff they don't like is on the landscape. So they're altering species composition based on palatability. And typically the stuff that's beneficial for wildlife, like oaks and some of the mass-producing species, for some reason taste better to the deer, so they eat them with more frequency, and as a result, there's lesser of them on the landscape. And the stuff that that isn't necessarily beneficial, it, for some reason, tastes bad, and there's more of that on the landscape. Anyway, and also, as I mentioned, they're transporting exotic seeds. So, as I mentioned, this is multiple studies coming together and just showing us that if we have healthy forests, we have healthy people, and we're hoping our research helps people manage their properties in terms of wildlife diversity, in terms of not favoring one species of wildlife, and also if we have more species of wildlife and healthier forests, that's going to trickle down to fewer ticks, fewer tick-borne illnesses, and a more healthy public. So healthy forests are going to benefit the animals, the trees, and people overall. So we're just hoping that people see that land management can play a role in public health, for better or for worse. I should acknowledge some of my colleagues, my postdoc, Dr. Megan Linsky, who I think you're going to hear from on some of her work in a week or two. This is my technician, Michael Short, another postdoc, Dr. Eliza Little. Dr. Gudars Mulai runs the tick testing laboratory at the Ag Station. Dr. Kirby Stafford is the tick guru in Connecticut. He is the chief scientist in the Department of Entomology and knows a heck of a lot about ticks. This is his technician, Heidi. My direct supervisor, Dr. Ward, a forester, forest ecologist, and our research assistant, Ms. Jamie Cantoni. So if you want to contact me, you can find me on the Agricultural Experiment Station website. We have a lot of resources available if you're interested that I could provide you with on ticks, on tick-borne diseases. And my email is scott.williams@ct.gov, or here's my phone number. You can contact me directly, but I'd be happy to talk to you. anyway, I hope you took something away from today's talk, and I'm certain we may have some questions. So let me get out of here. And
Hi, Scott. Thanks so much. Unfortunately, most of us are all too familiar with ticks on a personal level.
yeah,
We did have some questions, though. Someone asked if if they tend to latch on to indoor or outdoor cats. I would presume outdoor because they're outside. But is there a different answer to that?
no, they don't. They don't discriminate between any indoor or outdoor cats, or any animal for that matter. Um, but it's, an indoor cat is less likely to get a tick on it, obviously, because it's not outside. But a cat that comes and goes is more likely to obtain ticks outside, bring them inside, and there's more opportunity for that tick from that animal to crawl onto you or another cat or another pet within the house. We're soliciting folks to do some of our tick research, and we do some treatments with fungal sprays and some pesticides, and the people are often reluctant to do it because they think it's unsafe for their pet, but it's the people with the pets that should be doing it because the pets are coming and going and bringing ticks into the house. So it's a long answer, but no, they don't differentiate between indoor and outdoor cats.
That does bring us to one of the other questions, though. Someone wrote, we're seeing an increase of deer coming through our yard. With that comes the dropping. Should we apply tick spray for our yard? And he says he's very conflicted over this.
Yes, the deer will they'll drop off ticks in the yard. If there's anything, I don't think you necessarily have to apply a tick treatment to your yard just because you're seeing deer there. If you're seeing, ticks with more frequency, then yes, but just because deer are present doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be dropping off in your yard. So I would wait to do a treatment when you start seeing an increase in the tick abundance. And the deer may well change their patterns in a year or two and may not use your yard. And maybe there's something desirable this time of year. But I would hold off on that. And there are some, you don't have to use a synthetic pyrethroid that kills every insect on your property. There are other alternatives available. And some of these landscaping companies can provide you with some information. There are more natural products you can spray, which tend to just repel the ticks and keep them off your property temporarily. But they don't kill the ticks. So those have fairly limited life, maybe on the order of a couple of weeks before they need to be retreated. And then retreating, you're going to be, you're going to be paying for another service. So it's, and there are more targeted approaches for using some of these pesticides that kill the ticks. Where the majority of ticks are found on your yard is that interface between where your lawn meets the forest edge. About 80 to 85% of the ticks are found within that, say, 10-foot area between your lawn and forest edge. So if you just treat that area, you're going to be treating the majority of ticks on your property and not your gardens or stuff where you may encounter butterflies or other beneficial insects like ladybugs and honeybees and native pollinators and so forth. So there are targeted strategies you can utilize. And if people want more information on that, they can contact me.
Great. Someone asked if you found that the deer eat vegetable gardens.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Deer will eat anything. If humans can consume it, a deer is definitely going to consume it. When we were doing the study, we had a woman, a custodian of Asian descent, and I had her in the greenhouse and I was showing her what we were doing, and she said, we eat this in my country, we eat this in my country, we eat this in my country. She recognized all the plants that were growing that were exotic to here, but were brought over here from Asia for the food trade. So obviously if humans are eating it and planting it to eat themselves, deer are definitely going to eat those things. And deer will eat stuff also that's going to rot a human gut. But yes, vegetable garden, the best thing to do is to fence it off. But if that's not desirable, they do sell some repellent sprays you can spray that are labeled for use on produce. Some of them aren't labeled for use on produce just because they contain allergens like egg and fish, and there's a liability issue there. But you can still use it on produce, but because it's not, if you're not allergic to that stuff, but because it's not a systemic within the plant, it's just on the outside of it, and you can tend to wash that stuff off if the damage is too much. So I shouldn't be recommending off-label use of it, but in this case, if you're not allergic to that kind of thing, it's doable.
Another question was, which barberry treatment do you think was the most effective in your study?
That's a good question. Sorry, I glanced over that. It's the two-stage aspect is a must, because you're taking a plant that's 6 feet high by 6 feet wide, and by chopping it down, you're reducing it to a plant a couple months later that's the size of a basketball maybe. So you're reducing the size overall. So what we found most effective was chemical treatment as that second step. And instead of spraying, a plant that's 6 feet high by 6 feet wide, and you get all this overspray of chemical and more product than you need to use, we're spraying it, on a plant the size of a globe or a basketball or something at ground level. And we were able to use the plant's stressed out, so much more susceptible to death in using it. 2, we're using a much lesser volume, and 3, it's much more targeted, and you're not overspraying and hitting some of the beneficial vegetation on the landscape. So I know people, glyphosate and Roundup have a bad rap, but it binds readily to soil if it contacts it, and it decomposes very quickly. And if it's done using label use, it's very effective, and it's one of the only weapons we have against invasive plants. So if used by label, it's quite safe and effective in eradicating some of these stubborn plants.
So somebody mentioned they're in Colorado and they're thinking about moving east, and they're particularly concerned about the ticks. And she's watching this program to try to decide where to move to, I guess. It looks like it's a northern problem looking at your map. Is that because that's where the deer are?
Yes, it's mostly where the deer are, but Connecticut was kind of the epicenter for Lyme disease. Obviously, it's named for Lyme, Connecticut, and it's radiated out from here. And now, the ticks and the pathogens are radiated through Maine and southern Canada. Winters used to kind of regulate them, but because our winters are becoming more and more mild, the populations are radiating north and into Canada, as I mentioned. Ticks are a problem, and we're trying not to scare people away from the outdoors. Given the screen availability these days, we're trying to or dissuade them from moving to the Northeast or the East Coast generally. We're just trying to educate people on what to look for on the various stages when they're active, the various pathogens they carry, and just because you have a tick on you doesn't mean you're going to get infected with one of the pathogens that has to feed for 24 to 48 hours for the majority of these pathogens to get past. So it's not meant to be a scare tactic. It's meant to be an education and teach you what to look for, and just be wary when you're outdoors here in tick country to do a tick check. And even if you just run to the mailbox and back, or you just run out the dog in the lawn and the dog comes back, just be wary, and just be wary when ticks are most active, and take a look on yourself and prevent that tick from feeding, and prevent it from passing any pathogens to you.
People are also thanking you for your research, your important research, and your information, just so you know.
Oh, good.
What areas of the state have the highest tick problem?
What ticks have the highest? Well, I'm sorry. So, what parts of the state has the highest tick problem?
Right.
Well, we're just launched what's called an active tick surveillance program last year, in which we picked 5 locations in each of the Connecticut's 8 counties, and we're surveilling ticks there. And last year it happened to be Fairfield County that had the highest abundance, and that's typically because it's the warmest and most climate favorable. The shoreline is for the same reason tends to have higher abundances because the climate's more mild. So it varies from year to year, but generally it tends to be areas with more deer tend to have higher tick abundances. So it's typically Fairfield County and the shoreline.
Someone suggested we use opossums to help with the tick population. Do you want to speak to that?
That's gotten a lot of traction. Possums have been here forever, and yes, they happen to be good at grooming and they have good dexterity. But if they were going to help us with the tick population, why haven't they done so already? So, in the presence of possums here in the Northeast, the tick population's only gotten worse. So, that was a study done by colleagues of ours, and like I said, it's got a lot of traction, but I'm not sure how much utility it has.
That's too bad. We actually had some opossum experts last year, and her answer to that question was they will eat the ticks if they're on, if they find, something dead. They don't kill things, but if they find something dead, they'll eat them, and they'll eat the ticks, but they don't really chase them down or hunt
Right.
for them or look for
Right,
them.
that's right. So possums, if their tick is on them, they'll pull them off and either eat them or chuck them. But same goes for turkeys. People think turkeys and guinea hens will solve the tick problem, but if they happen across a tick, they will consume it, sure. But it's just not a very valuable food source. It's pretty insignificant nutritionally, so they're not going to chase them down and eat them.
Which is too bad.
Yeah.
So someone is asking, what can we do as property owners to decrease the tick population and increase the biodiversity and help the local ecosystem?
Well, Megan's going to tell you all about that in a week or two. But right, with increased biodiversity comes, you have more reservoir incompetent hosts. So if ticks are feeding on them, they're less likely to get infected. So if you have higher diversity, you tend to have lower infection. And something you can do is, garden for wildlife, plant wildlife friendly plantings, soft mast shrubs that come back year to year, either blueberries or high bush cranberries or winterberries or something to increase the diversity of wildlife in your yard. And that's beneficial to them, it's enjoyable to you, and it also, benefits you personally and your family because you're reducing pathogen infection in the ticks on your property. So that's one thing. You can do invasive control on your property as well. Get rid of some of these invasive plants that are no good for anything, and except creating more invasive plants, and just do some basic management like that.
Someone has a concern, as do I, about the stuff people are spraying on their lawns, harming other wildlife, birds. You mentioned about being very specific about the areas that you put the treatments on, but there's these new companies that have sprung up that claim to get rid of all the ticks in your yard, and they're doing mass sprayings. What's your thought about that?
Right, there's different levels, and people are still kind of stuck in the silent spring mentality where it was if you don't know, that's a book written by Rachel Carson back in the 60s about DDT largely, but it's a lot of these chemicals have evolved over the years to be more specific to the targeted insect that they are treating. So technology has come a long way. And then, as I mentioned, you can spray at the periphery of your yard. You could be much more targeted. You could use some of these repellents that don't kill them but repel them. And the applicators have to wear masks and respirators regardless of what they're spraying, whether it's toxic or a repellent, because if you're ingesting it, breathing it, it's not good. I mean, to breathe anything that's not toxic, to get that in your lungs is not good. So that's why they wear that protective equipment regardless of what they're spraying. Because if you're spraying orange juice on the landscape all day and you're and breathing that in, that's not going to be good for you, even though it's just orange juice. So there's targeted areas in your lawn you can use to reduce the volume of the product, or there's different products you can use. There's a fungal spray, or there used to be, it might be off the market now, that would adhere to the tick cuticle and grow and overwhelm and kill the tick that way. And it was pretty specific to ticks. But again, if you target that area of the yard I'm talking about, you're going to kill the majority of the ticks on your property, and there aren't many other beneficial insects or on that periphery. And some of those repellent types aren't going to impact birds or anything. But it's just best to do a targeted treatment in that area where you find the ticks.
Good to know. I think we've answered all the questions that I see. I want to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and all that research you do on one of the most unpopular insects. That's
Yeah, nobody likes them.
Nobody likes them.
I'll agree on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and
Thank you.
everybody be safe. Again, this will be broadcast on Facebook Live all day, and you'll be able to find it in the archives on our Facebook page, on our website. So thank you, and we'll see you next Saturday.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.